Hey there! Welcome back to the Mirror Project. We're your hosts, Alexandra.
And Christine.
Today, we are discussing the kind of strength that doesn't show up in grand gestures or loud declarations. It's quieter, but relentless. It's the decision to keep moving forward, even when your body is tired, your heart is heavy, and your path feels lonely. A while back, we came across a trending audio clip and it stopped us in our tracks. It said, "You really think she keeps going because it doesn't hurt? The truth is, it hurts her more than she will ever admit to you. When she's tired, she keeps going. When she's scared, she keeps going. When she feels like she's going to fail, she keeps going. When she feels like she is all alone, she still keeps going. Because she knows standing still is not going to get her the life that she knows she deserves. So you can either get with her or get out of her way. Because no matter what, she is going to keep going." That's not just a quote. That is a whole vibe for anyone who's ever had to keep going when their tank is on empty. Today, we're unpacking resilience. What it really means, how it looks in real life, not just the inspirational quotes or posts, but in our daily decisions, our quiet battles, and the way we show up for ourselves when no one's watching. We'll talk about how to build it, how to nurture it, and how to know the difference between pushing through and truly growing through. So grab your tea, get comfortable, and let's get into it. Before we delve into today's riveting topic, make sure to hit that like, subscribe, or follow button on your favorite listening platform. Take a moment to do it now before it slips your mind. Trust us, we're not getting started without you. Let's make this journey together.
Hey, before we dive in, Alexandra, why don't we start by doing something new? Can we pull a card before we start our chat today?
Can we pull a card? Yes, of course we can. And what a great topic, since I actually have a deck that is called Soul Seeds Words of Resilience. So I feel like
Okay,
this is
well, that's pretty
perfectly
perfect.
on
Yes.
brand.
Hell
For anyone
yeah.
who's listening, if you are interested, this deck can be found by the artist Jessica Filloon on Etsy. So, all right,
Thank you, Jessica.
hold while we shuffle. That one? Thank you. Ooh, I think this is great. Great card. So it says, "To take care of others, I must take care of myself."
That is really good. It's like that analogy you always hear on the airplane. You got to put your face mask on before you can help others.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're not well, then how can you properly care for someone else? Yeah.
And I feel like this is something we're really going to get into in a little bit because as we talk about building resiliency and what it really is, I think it's so often that we disregard what we need in favor of others.
Right.
Why don't we get into what resiliency really looks like? So, what are
Let's
some
do it.
myths about resiliency that you've heard, that we've heard, that we just feel like are so inaccurate that we just need to say, hey, based on our experience, that's not resiliency?
I think one of the biggest things is like just sort of when you're faced with hardship or something happens in your life, I think people believe that they should suppress that of what's happening to them and not face it and just try and keep moving forward, but ultimately that's just going to do you more harm. And like pretending that everything's okay even when it's really not okay, it's just a form of denial, really, and that is not really helping you move forward. It's keeping you stuck.
Right. Do you think that's something people inherently do? Or do you think it's something that we have been conditioned to do?
I think it's I think it's probably conditioned, right? Because one of the things that I kind of took away from prepping for this episode, and I was sort of like diving into more, because like you, for me, I understand what resilience means, right? But I've not read a definition or have looked up resources and things like that. So
Hmm.
by prepping for this episode, I was doing that a little bit. And one of the many things I took away from it was that it's something you can learn and grow, because
Hmm.
it's how you learn to react to what's happening to you, how you it's how you learn to deal with what's happening to you. So if you're not given the tools to properly deal with what you're going through, then you're already at a disadvantage. And I think culturally, more often than not, we've been conditioned to keep things suppressed, and
Hmm.
that in controlling it, you have a power over it. By suppressing, you're controlling it, and thus you have a power over it. But really, it's just doing you more harm, and in a way, harming you twice over. What you're
Hmm.
going through has harmed you, and now you're physically, like, well, potentially physically harming yourself because of how stress and anxiety can have effects on the body. But you're harming yourself in addition to struggling with what you're going through. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I love what you said about tools. And I think that
Mm,
kind of goes to another myth. Like some people are just resilient. And I think that's many people are finding that not to be true. It's something that we can learn and we can practice and we can grow.
mm. I
I
wonder
don't
if
think it's this.
people. Go
Go
ahead.
ahead.
Sorry.
I was gonna say I
I was
don't
just
think
gonna.
it's this. All right, you go.
I'm so sorry. Okay, I was just gonna say. I wonder if people think that surviving and resilience are synonyms of one another. You know,
Mm,
like in terms of, I think people are hardwired to figure out a way to survive.
mm-hmm. Okay.
And I think people may think that by surviving something, you are resilient. But you can survive something and not deal with what you have done, not deal with what you have gone through, or survive. Surviving doesn't mean you're thriving or healthy, like mentally, or
Right.
that you've dealt with what you've been forced into, or what has happened to someone in your life, or things like that. Surviving is just like figuring out a way to keep living. But resilience is one of the things we talked about that you brought up, Alexandra, in our prep for this, is there's a level of self-awareness
Mm-hmm.
that one has. So that was what I was so rudely interrupting you. And I'm sorry you lost your train of thought.
No, it's all good. Yeah, I like what you were saying, and I think that kind of ties into resiliency is almost like the whole. It's almost for the whole body, right? We survive things mentally, physically, emotionally. And I think resiliency can be built in each of those areas, like mental resilience, physical resilience, and emotional resiliency. And it's something I think that each of them takes awareness about, like you were saying. You have to be aware of what you're feeling, how you're reacting to it, and what is your general response to something. And I think from there, you can build resiliency and patterns that help you not just survive something, but as we previously mentioned, really grow from what you've been through.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you brought up a really interesting point when we were prepping for this episode. I think you mentioned something about people idolizing or not idolizing, have an idealistic sense of survival. Can you share more about what you were saying when we were prepping?
Okay, yeah. So I think, was this about ego?
Yes.
So, okay. So something that came to me as we were first sort of spitballing ideas about how we wanted to frame this conversation, something that kind of came to mind was this idea that resiliency has no ego. Meaning, I think in the age we live in, and even since the beginning of time, what kind of brought this idea that resiliency has no ego was, I think, from what I've sort of seen around me, what I see on social media, is some people using the idea of resiliency as a way to brag about what they've gone through and
Mm.
boost their ego by saying, "Look at me and all that I have survived." But I think resilience is something much more quiet, and
Hmm.
it's sort of introspective. It's not, it's, ego doesn't have a place in that practice. So that's what really sort of hit me first when we were thinking about the idea of resiliency. And for those who have figured out the tools you need to be resilient, it's one of those quiet superpowers. And
Hmm.
I like that idea because it is a superpower. And one of the things I think we can all sort of take away from the idea of a superhero is like they're just doing what they need to keep moving forward.
I like
Did
that.
I answer your question?
I think so. Yeah, I think that perfectly shared what I was trying to get into.
Cool.
And I think that you make a really good point about what we see on social media, right? And different things regarding this or any topic. We see very specific versions that people are presenting. And you're right, I don't think ego has a place in resiliency. And I
Mm-hmm.
think it's very different if you see people, like you said, taking an opportunity to brag and say, "Oh, look at what I have survived." And conversely, I do think there are content creators and other people who share wonderful resources on how to build resiliency, and I would encourage people to listen to those, particularly if it provides practical application of resiliency, not just a platform for somebody to share
Mm-hmm.
everything that they have survived. Not to diminish what people have survived, but as you said, I think there's a difference between surviving and bragging about something versus that quiet superpower.
Yeah, and I think there is a difference between bragging and sharing your stories so others
Yeah.
don't feel alone. I think that's certainly one of our goals out of this podcast, and how I sort of want to just live my life is be as open and vulnerable as possible when I feel safe to do so, so that I can make those around me feel like they're not alone in what they're going through. So, yeah.
I feel like that brings up a great point when you're talking about vulnerability.
Okay.
I'm trying to think about how best to get into this. Okay, Christine, can you share with us like the definition? I think sometimes positivity, particularly toxic positivity, can kind of get confused or conflated with resiliency. And I know you had found pulled up some definitions and information. Would you mind sharing with everyone what toxic positivity is versus what
Yeah.
resiliency is? Because I think that has a wonderful tie-in to vulnerability that you were talking about a moment ago.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So, toxic positivity, it's one of those terms that sounds upbeat. Sounds like it should be a good thing, but it actually is referring to something pretty harmful. So, toxic positivity is the pressure to stay positive no matter how bad or painful things are. It's the belief that you should always look on the bright side, even when what you really need is support, empathy, and a space to feel your emotions. Whereas resiliency is the ability to bounce back from adversity, adapt to change, and keep going in the face of challenges. It's not about avoiding struggle, it's about moving through it and growing from it. So, the takeaway from that, I would say, is resiliency is facing something head on and working through it while moving forward, whereas toxic positivity is suppressing or making you feel ashamed about the struggles you're doing in an effort to just stay positive and everything will be okay.
And I feel like that toxic positivity certainly is fed into by what you mentioned earlier about people wanting to control situations, so they kind of shove stuff down and being conditioned to do so. So it's really interesting to see some of that conditioning
Yeah.
shift into this toxic positivity. And I think you said
Yeah.
something about emotions being labeled as not good. And I know we had mentioned this in a previous episode, but I think I don't know that that's a good habit for people to get into, as labeling certain emotions as good or
Negative.
bad.
Yeah.
Because if what we're talking about with resiliency and vulnerability is learning to cope and deal with and grow through emotions and say, okay, this situation, this thing is causing this emotion and causing this physical reaction.
Right.
How do I deal with it? And so I think that's a really, I don't know if dichotomy is the word I'm looking for, but it's a really interesting, almost like two sides of the same coin. Like one side you've got
Yeah.
resiliency, and the other side it's like faux resiliency.
And to your point about there being good and bad emotions, I mean, the only reason why something would be bad, like related to an emotion, is how you choose to act on that emotion. It's the
Hmm.
action that can make it bad. Like anger isn't inherently a bad thing. It's a trigger for you to stop and, with the right tools, understand why you're feeling angry.
Hmm.
Like I just something I have been unpacking more and more is unlearning or not trying to put my emotions in a category in a specific category, because they're all important to help me understand myself, where I fit in the world, why I'm feeling the way I'm feeling. It
Hmm.
helps put it into words. And I think, and it, to the point of we've been conditioned to suppress things. We've been conditioned to think there are good and bad emotions
Hmm.
and that we should feel negatively or positively about certain emotions. I think one of the things I saw when prepping for this was you can you can feel good, you can feel joy and pain at the same time. Now,
Hmm.
that can be hard to quantify, but we as human beings are very complex. So, and we don't
Yeah.
always fully understand why we feel the way we feel and why we can feel two things at the same time. Why
Yeah. That's,
two truths can, why there can be two truths.
hmm I think that goes to the complexity you were talking about. And by saying, or even thinking of emotion, if I can only feel this or this, is a lack of awareness about what we
Yeah.
truly are, or trying to control what you feel when that is really, I think sometimes before really building resiliency practice, you just have to be aware of how you react before before trying to control it. And as somebody who's a wee bit of a perfectionist and likes to have a step by step lay out everything, know the answer, where are we going, that's a hard pill to swallow
Sure.
and
Yeah.
you'll learn.
And I think also in this idea of about how we're conditioned, I think a lot of people may suppress things because they think they're protecting themselves, and it's like
Mm.
a trauma response, a way to shut down and not hurt themselves further. But in actuality, that is doing you harm because you're not able to move forward as a result. And that's when finding community, finding professional help, whether that's through therapy, can really help you build the tools needed to work towards resilience and move through what you've been through. So, my point was, it's not always intentional, right? Sometimes
Hmm.
it's what you've been conditioned to, it's not always a conscious choice. But to the point about learning to be resilient, it's that self-awareness. Like you need to reach the point of, okay, so what my initial response isn't probably the healthiest. What do I need to do to move forward from this in a healthy way?
I think that's definitely a trial and error process too, because I think resiliency really is like an individual path. There are many tools that people can collectively use and practice, but their results may not look the same. But yeah, I like that. Craving more of our company? Join the fun over on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube at Mere Project Pod. Dive deeper into our world and engage with us on a whole new level. Don't miss out on the excitement.
On this note about vulnerability, I think it's a perfect opportunity for us to be a little vulnerable and share some personal stories and talk about when resilience for us has been tested. So,
Sure.
Alexander, do you have anything that you want to share or that has come up as we started talking?
It's so funny. I was just thinking, I think a lot of our conversations tend to, in my head, run together because while we are talking about specific topics and themes, we can kind of see how everything really isn't separated out that way. Like it all kind of flows and works together. So I think
Mm.
one of the big things I've worked on resiliency around is what we talked about in the therapy episode and body health and image episodes, is coping and dealing with my what eating disorder when I was a teenager. And I don't think I did. And I mentioned in the therapy episode how much work I've done in the past year in therapy. Yeah, really a little over a year,
Mm.
actually almost a year and a half at this point to be quite honest, is and that's something that my therapist has worked with me a lot is reframing and keep going. And I think there are many things I'm good at and good at quickly. And dealing with my eating disorder, dealing with not liking my body and wanting to lose weight, but struggling and constantly failing to in a way that kept stuff off really kind of tested that, and I felt like quitting and like I was a failure. I was quitting all the time. So really working on resiliency and saying, reframing what is my goal in
Mm.
losing weight or loving my body, and it's to genuinely love my body, not try to make it fit into what the world says is beautiful or other people's ideas. And what that looked like was resiliency, and when things are not going my way and it doesn't immediately happen, how do I keep going with it? How do I keep building the practices that allow me mental flexibility to deal with everyday life? Because let's be honest, if we think about like diet culture and stuff, it's a very rigid programs, right? And it works for
Mm.
some people. I'm not saying it doesn't work for everyone, but it works for some people. And for me, it doesn't, because it's like you were talking about, Christine, earlier, where we are complex beings and you can feel both happiness and sadness at the same time. And I so think for me, kind of splitting out, I'm only going to work on the mental part of, my eating disorder, or the physical part, and not integrating those two
Mm.
really stunted me from dealing with resiliency. And this is a lighter topic, I feel like, of building resiliency on. But I think that's one thing I really struggled with. And just the suppressing of being disappointed and saying, well, I haven't done this, so I need to punish myself and work out harder or eat whatever it was. And saying
Mm-hmm.
that's not really resilience. That was, you just survived something. And
Right.
I don't know if I was really surviving it. So Christine, now that
Okay.
I've shared that somewhat
Mm-hmm.
maybe a more lighthearted example,
I don't know about lighthearted, but
what about you? Where have you practiced and grown resiliency?
so I think a lot of, perhaps for me, the resilience has sort of come later because I didn't know necessarily how to face what I was dealing with in the present moment as things were happening. But one of the recent examples was dealing with the loss of someone close to you, of close to me, dealing with the loss of my grandfather as I was working, because up until that point, the people who had passed in my life, I was in school. The two I my mom's father passed away when I was in high school, and it was in the summertime. And then my grandmother passed away when I was in college, and it was the summertime. So those were my most recent, before my grandfather passing, the most recent experiences I had with losing a loved one. And it was when I was on break from school. I was afforded the time to deal with what I was going through.
Mm-hmm.
When I lost my grandfather, I was working at my last job. If there are new listeners here, what I was doing before my current job, I was in event and fundraising, basically planning large scale events for different clients, which is a very demanding job, if you don't know, very stressful. And I was in the middle, though I didn't necessarily know at the time, of a toxic work environment. And I lost my grandfather in the spring of 2022. And it was, we were gearing up for our spring event season. So it was the first time I had to figure out a way to deal with losing somebody and just still showing up for work every day.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really hard. I I remember my mom took me out to eat for dinner the week he passed away to let me know that this was happening. I went into work the next day and I shared it with my boss at the time. And then, with going into that weekend, he did pass away. And for those who don't know, there is a bereavement. Most jobs will give you a bereavement period, and that's sort of dependent on the relationship of the loved one who had passed away to you in terms of how long they'll give you off. However, I wasn't afforded that at my job at the time because we were in our spring season, and I think I only took 1 or 2 days off of work, and then I had to come back from the weekend where we buried my grandfather and do an event. And that was really hard. And I wasn't really given the support at my job because there wasn't enough support staff. One, we were a very small team. There was 3 of us, and one of the team members was sick at the time. I'm now just remembering. She had COVID. So we were already down a member, and I felt like I was put in the very uncomfortable situation where like I couldn't take the proper time to grieve and to deal with what was going on. So this is why my point of I didn't really necessarily do the work and sort of move through until well after it was happening, because I wasn't afforded the opportunity to do so. And then that sort of just fed into that whole work situation, realizing how toxic and harmful it was for me. I had countless conversations with Alexandra, her mom, my dad, my friends, and it sort of ultimately led to this bigger sort of turning point for me where I truly needed to face what was going on, right?
Mm-hmm.
I needed to do the introspection and gain the self-awareness. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
Christine, you can't just be numb to this. This is actively harming you. And only in this moment am I really sort of correlating like this was probably the catalyst for me to really think about, okay, this is how did I end up in this situation? How do I how do I move forward from this situation?
And I
Yeah.
think there's something really important that you mentioned in there. Like you didn't have the time or space to
Mm.
properly deal with the grief of the loss of your grandfather.
Yeah.
And I think that reinforces because, like you said, it depends on your employer. Not everyone is given bereavement leave or has that opportunity. And there's many things in life that happen without us having the space and time to cope with it in that minute or
Right.
to work through it. And I think that just highlights how important practicing resiliency, building that up over time, helps us in those moments when you don't have a lot of space or time to deal with something that we can, I don't want to say deal with because I feel like that's, oh, deal with it and get rid of it, but work through what's happening. I think that just really highlighted that point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in those moments what helps the most is in my situation it was the people around me. It was my loved ones, it was my friends and family who were there to support me,
Mm-hmm.
hear me yell, cry, talk through and help process what I was dealing with. So, I'm really grateful for all of that.
And you were dealing with many different things on many different fronts. So it's
Yeah.
giving yourself grace and it's hard to give yourself time and space to deal with one major change when you also have a very difficult work situation or other things are happening. It's almost like what gets my attention
Yeah.
first because it all it all requires attention. It all requires unpacking or dealing with and coping with.
Mhm. Absolutely.
So, well, now that we've talked about some of our shared experiences with resiliency, do you have any examples of when toxic positivity was shoved in your, I don't want to say just shoved down your throat,
Mm,
or you grabbed on to toxic positivity thinking
sure.
this is the thing that'll help me through something.
Absolutely. I think I struggle with toxic positivity a lot growing up. I don't, because I feel like, I don't know about you, but to me, that term is kind of a buzzword term
Mm-hmm.
that I don't know if it existed when we were growing up. And similar to like toxic masculinity, gaslighting, these are things that always
Mm.
existed, but they didn't have
The
a, uh,
label.
the label until fairly recently. So I remember growing up, and this also is something I just sort of like was I typed in what is toxic positivity because I like with resiliency I had a base understanding of what that meant,
Mm-hmm.
but it wasn't until I like looked it up that it helped give examples to it too. So for example, examples of toxic positivity is like saying just stay positive if
Mm.
someone's grieving a loss, which what I would never say something like that to somebody
Mm-mm.
grieving. Responding with everything happens for a reason when someone, a friend, opens up about a tough situation they're going through.
It's like
That,
Just pour lemon juice and salt in the wound. Just
Right?
without even the
That's not
courtesy of giving you
helpful.
a shot of tequila.
Yeah. So both of those 2 points, I was like, well, that's not something I would ever even think about.
Mhm.
But then these last two things was like, oh, okay. So I fell into toxic positivity and I didn't even know it. Those last 2 points are forcing yourself to smile and suppress sadness or anger. I was the queen of that when I was a kid. And feeling guilty for having negative emotions because you should be
Mm.
grateful. I struggled with that a lot. The idea of I don't have any right to feel sad because I have a wonderful life. I have parents who love me, a roof over my head, a place where I loved and taken care of.
Mhm.
But and it's not that I necessarily was can like anyone said anything to me like, "Oh, you shouldn't feel sorry or you should be grateful."
Mhm.
That just was something, I don't know where that came from. That just was sort of, for me, as far as I know, was just a natural thought that came to me. It wasn't necessarily implanted, as far as I know. I mean, I have wonderful parents. I only have positive. I mean, they're not perfect, but
No one is really.
right, but I look back on growing up and while there were like some hard times, there was also always a conscious effort by both my parents to sit us down and like they wanted to be better than their parents
Mhm.
and they were figuring out a way to show up for their kids as best they could. So that's what I remember when I look back on it. But I don't necessarily know where that idea of I don't have a right to feel this way took root.
And
Yeah.
it's really interesting because it truly diminishes what you're feeling.
Yeah, I was diminishing, like I was putting myself down. Like
Mhm.
no one was really doing it, but I was doing it, and I don't
Right.
know.
And I almost wonder if it adds in an unhealthy comparison to other people in their life because objectively you can people look at people's lives and say they're better, they're worse. But when you bring that into dealing with your own emotions and what you should and should not feel, it's a very because I think we all hear, oh, you shouldn't compare yourself to others. And for some people, super maybe really easy, but for I know Christine and I, we've had conversations about how that can be difficult. And then it's almost compounding it by saying, I'm not even allowed to feel this way. Because in comparison, like you said, I have a roof over head, I have loving parents. It's just really interesting. Maybe think about that when you said it.
It was a perfect opportunity to sort of reflect and think on like how you might not even realize what you're like inherently doing and how it is actually harmful and toxic to yourself, to those around you.
Mm. Why don't we talk about some practices and things to build resiliency? What have you used in the past to help build your resiliency or start that journey?
Big thing was talking to my loved ones, to my friends. That always helped me process, work through what was happening, writing things down. I'm not the best at journaling, but in the moments where like I couldn't shut my brain off, like that always helped in terms of getting it out of my body. So talking to those closest to me, journaling, talking to myself,
Hmm.
trying to speak kindly to myself. I think in one of our previous episodes, it might have been the mantra episode, or and then I think it came up again in our New Year Same Us conversation that we had a few weeks back.
Hmm.
That when things were really bad for me a few years ago with my job and all of that, just talking out loud to myself, trying to talk to myself like I would a friend or a family member who is struggling how like I was
Hmm.
struggling. And physically talking. Like saying the words out loud, not just in your head. That really really helped.
Hmm.
So those are a couple. What about for you? What sort of practices has helped you the most?
Well, I think, and you know, I've shouted it from the rooftops. My therapist has really helped. And what she's really helped with me in terms of resiliency is reframing situations.
Mm.
I think I don't always see myself or situations very clearly. So it is very helpful to have somebody else reframe. And then that has since taught me through practice and, sessions how to reframe for myself. One thing I find interesting and helpful is meditation, but specifically if people have heard of it's called a witness meditation.
Hmm.
So it's obviously meditating. And I think there's a misconception about meditating, and I think we might have talked about this in the sayings and mantras episode of like to clear your mind is the goal, and it's not really, it's just kind of to be quiet. And as though, so the point of the witness meditation, as things, thoughts, emotions come up, is to notice them, be aware of them, but not get attached to them
Mm.
and kind of follow them down a rabbit hole. Or that process is just to say, oh hey, that thought is there, this emotion's coming up, not to really label it other than say, hey, I notice you. And I think that kind of goes back to
Mm.
what we had talked about earlier in what I think really is the first step to resiliency is awareness. So being aware of when you're being really hard on yourself or when you're suppressing emotions, and before jumping into dealing with working with something, just saying, oh wow, I'm feeling anger right now, and just kind of
Mm.
letting it be. I have found that to be really helpful. Trying to think of what else. And treating each moment, each time you're confronted with like maybe something that triggers what would normally you would say, I'm going to suppress this, or I'm going to try and control this, or I'll just be put a smile on and deal with it later or get through it,
Mm.
is to treat each opportunity as moment as a new opportunity. So,
Mm.
and building a bit more mental flexibility around things. I think that's what has helped me,
Mm. Mental flexibility. Hmm.
which I think ties into the self-talk, like how you talk about
Yeah,
how you internally talk about yourself.
very true.
I know we've talked about like cultural upbringing, how that's kind of had an impact on this. Is there anything you think we are forgetting in the process of building and nurturing resilience?
I don't know if we've necessarily forgot anything. I guess one thing we haven't explored, I don't know how it would necessarily factor into this conversation, but in the idea of upbringing, there's also like generational trauma, something that isn't even necessarily conscious, but still affects if something happens in your family, like the ramifications that has long after something happens to someone. I think that factors in and
Mm-hmm.
plays a role into your environment, into how you view the world, because it's what you were taught to be the truth or what
Mm-hmm.
reality was. But yeah, no, I think otherwise I can't think of anything else. Can you?
Well, what role do you think joy or fun or happiness kind of plays in this journey in building resiliency?
It helps me a lot. It does. I would be a very different person if I wasn't able to see the humor in life or laugh at myself or be like being creative to me is a lifeline. It's how I can make sense of things. It's how I can express myself. It can help me sort of like step out of my world for a minute and just because sometimes you just need a break and not necessarily disassociate, although sometimes that happens too, but it helps you focus on something else for a little bit so that subconsciously you can deal with something. I think they have a huge role. I think they are why a lot of would save a lot of people, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think a life without humor and creativity would be a really bleak and dreary existence.
I'll say I think
So,
that's one benefit of our friendship that you've really taught me over the years is how to laugh at myself, and otherwise I can be a bit serious. So it's been super helpful. And
sure.
I think that's an excellent point to make in the building resiliency, because it's certainly not something most people come out of the gate perfect at doing. So
Right.
being able to
Sure.
have humor and laugh as you mess up, or you go, wow, that didn't work, and you try something
Yeah.
else.
I think ultimately resiliency is okay, falling down, that's inevitable, but getting back up and even laughing a little while you're doing it is how you keep moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Is there any other last minute points? I think also, since we started the episode with a card, what if we ended our episode with a card, with pulling a card? How do we feel
Sure.
about that? Okay, let's
I
do
mean,
it.
we can.
So
No,
let's
just
do a
kidding. We
little
absolutely won't.
let's do a little reminder. What was the one we pulled at the start?
So at the beginning, we pulled to take care of others, I must take care of myself. And then let's see.
Okay.
So second card. There it is.
Ooh.
Thank you. Interesting. What is truly for me will not miss me.
Okay. I think there are little signs from the universe that if you open yourself up to them, they'll reveal themselves to you. Well, thank you for doing that. I liked this.
Absolutely.
I think we should do this more. So those listening, if you liked that little element we've added in this week, let us know. Either way, we're going to keep doing it.
It'll show up next time.
All right, everyone. If you're listening to this and you're in the thick of it, tired, stretched thin, maybe even wondering if you've got anything left in the tank, we just want to remind you the fact that you're still here, still trying, still getting up, that is resilience. It's not about being unbreakable. It's about being willing to piece yourself back together over and over again, even if it's messy, and it will be messy, even if no one sees it but you. And maybe resilience isn't about pushing through no matter what. It's about knowing when to rest, when to ask for help, and when to soften. Sometimes the most resilient thing you can do is give yourself grace. As always, we'd love to hear how resilience shows up in your life, what has helped you keep going when things got tough. Drop a message, share your story, or send this episode to someone who might need a little reminder of their own quiet strength. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and remember, even when the world gets loud, your strength doesn't have to be. It just has to be yours. All right, guys, we'll see you next time. Bye.
See you next time. Bye.
Are you enjoying the banter and insights we're serving up? If so, consider tossing some support our way through our Buy Us a Coffee page. Every bit helps in fueling this passion project of ours. Find the link in our show notes or visit our link tree. We're immensely grateful for your generosity. As we wrap up, remember to hit that like, subscribe, or follow button on your preferred platform. Until next time, let's keep the conversation going. We'll catch you on the next episode.